Good afternoon. Today I'm going to begin our session by presenting a video that I completed last night in which Dr. Edward Edinger discusses the overarching significance in which guess I better turn that phone off. In which Dr. Edward Edinger talks about the overarching significance of Dr. Jung to religion in general, to all religions. And the part I want to play with you is going to contain about 30 seconds of the Edinger lecture that I've previously mentioned. But then this will be new material, and then I will come back on live and talk about the next section of Answer to Job, as we've discussed. And of course, this video does contain some significant aspects of Answer to Job. Hi, Gray. Thanks for coming. Let's just see if... Oops. In his 1994 interview, Dr. Edward Edinger, you should be seeing that video, and I'll turn my mic off for the time being. If you're not seeing it, please let me know. And by that, he meant all the religions in the world. Let me play that section of his interview for you.
What does Jungian psychology have to do with religion?
Everything. Everything. You see, Jung has demonstrated that the religious function resides in the psyche and is an integral part of human psychology.
Okay, so today I'm going to read to you a chapter of a book that Dr. Edinger wrote, which gives a more thorough explanation of what Dr. Edinger is saying in this video. The book I'm reading from is The Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament. I'm reading from chapter 1. The Bible and the Psyche. Quote, "We must read the Bible or we shall not understand psychology. Our psychology, whole lives, our language and imagery are built upon the Bible." C.G. Jung. This book was published by Inner City Books in 1986. As the 21st century approaches, we are witnessing the emergence of a whole new worldview growing out of depth psychology. This new science studies the psyche as an experienceable, objective phenomenon. It takes old data and approaches them in a new way. For instance, mythology, religion, and sacred scriptures of all kinds are taken out of their traditional contexts and understood psychologically. That is, are seen as the phenomenology of the objective psyche. From this view, the Bible is considered to be a self-revelation of the objective psyche. As Jung says, quote, "The statements made in the Holy Scriptures are also utterances of the soul. They point to realities that transcend consciousness. These entia are the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Heretofore, these transcendent psychic entities have appeared as metaphysical contents of religious dogma, but now," writes Jung, quote, "a scientific psychology must regard those transcendental intuitions that sprang from the human mind in all ages as projections, that is, as psychic contents that were extrapolated in metaphysical space and hypostasized. It is no easy transition from the metaphysical standpoint of religious faith to the empirical standpoint of the psyche. Between these two mountain ridges lies a dark valley, the valley of lost faith, alienation, meaninglessness, and despair. For those who are perched safely on the ridge of religious faith, the psychological approach can be seen as an interesting addition to the more secure viewpoint they already possess. However, for those who, consciously or unconsciously, have already slipped off the ridge of faith and are in the dark valley, the discovery of the psychological approach may just possibly be life-saving. This approach is an admission of spiritual bankruptcy. It is available only to the poor of spirit, for as Jung says, quote, "I am not addressing myself to the happy possessors of faith, but to those many people for whom the light has gone out. The mystery has faded, and God is dead. For most of them there is no going back, and one does not know either whether going back is the better way. To gain an understanding of religious matters, probably all that is left us today is the psychological approach. That is why I take these thought forms that have become historically fixed, try to melt them down again, and pour them into molds of immediate experience." The Old Testament documents a sustained dialogue between God and man as it is expressed in the sacred history of Israel. It presents us with an exceedingly rich compendium of images representing encounters with the numinosum. These are best understood psychologically as pictures of the encounter between the ego and the self, which is the major feature of individuation. The Old Testament is thus a grand treasury of individuation symbolism. These venerable stories derive from countless individual experiences of the numinosum, and their psychic substance has been augmented through the ages by the pious worship and reflection of millions. When these facts are realized, we discover once again that the Old Testament is indeed a holy book. It is quite literally the Ark of the Covenant in which resides the power and glory of the transpersonal psyche. We must therefore approach it with caution, honoring its numinous power. The psychological approach takes the Bible as it is, on the hypothesis that the collective psyche has semi-purposely selected and arranged it over the course of the centuries. While respecting the methods of biblical criticism, the psychological standpoint is not concerned that a particular passage of the Pentateuch comes from the J source rather than the E. Also, the sequence is considered significant. The Hebrew Bible, based on the Masoretic text 600 to 900 AD, consists of 24 books gathered into 3 parts: the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings. The arrangement of Old Testament books in the Christian Bible derives from the Greek translation made from 280 to 150 BC. This arrangement emphasizes a linear development process consistent with the historical, time-bound quality of the Western psyche. According to this version, the Old Testament is composed of 39 books, arranged sequentially in 3 categories: 17 historical books, 5 books of wisdom and poetry, and 17 prophetic books shown opposite. I see this arrangement as a balance. On one side are the historical books in which Yahweh deals with Israel collectively as a nation. At this stage, individuation imagery is carried by the nation as a whole, the chosen people. On the other side are the prophetic books, each one named after a great individual who had a personal encounter with Yahweh and was fated to be an individual carrier of God consciousness. In the middle are the poetic wisdom books, with Job at their head. Job is the pivot of the Old Testament story. That is why Jung focused his Bible commentary on Job. Here, for the first time, a man encounters Yahweh as an individual and not as a function of the collective. Similarly, Yahweh did not deal with Job as a representative of Israel, but rather as an individual man. This book thus marks the transition from collective psychology to individual psychology, from group and church religion to the individual's lonely encounter with the numinosum. After Job comes the wisdom literature, as though the individual's encounter with the self has generated wisdom, or, as Jung puts it in answer to Job, as though the demonstration of Job's greater consciousness has obliged Yahweh to remember his feminine counterpart, divine wisdom, Sophia. The events of the Bible, although presented as history, psychologically understood, are archetypal images, pleromatic events that repeatedly erupt into spatio-temporal manifestation and require an individual ego to live them out. As we read these stories with an openness to their unconscious reverberations, we recognize them to be relevant to our own most private experience. We are then reading the Bible the way Emerson tells us to read history. Quote, "The fact narrated must correspond to something in me to be credible or intelligible. We, as we read, must become Greeks, Romans, Turks, priest and king, martyr and executioner, must fasten these images to some reality in our secret experience, or we shall learn nothing rightly. What befell Asdrubal and Caesar Borgia is as much an illustration of the mind's powers and deprivations as what has befallen us. Each new law and political movement has a meaning for you. Stand before each of its tablets and say, quote, 'Under this mask did my Proteus nature hide itself,' unquote. This remedies the defect of our great nearness to ourselves. This throws our actions into perspective. And as crabs, goats, scorpions, the balance, and the water pot lose their meanness when hung as signs in the zodiac, so I can see my own vices without heat in the distant persons of Solomon, Alcibiades, and Catiline." Unquote. Jung tells us that the book of Job serves as a paradigm for a certain experience of God which has a special significance for us today. The same can be said of many other contents of the Old Testament. The new insights of depth psychology allow us to relate the mighty mythologems of the Bible to the depth experience of individuals. Christ reinterpreted the Old Testament as foreshadowing of his coming. For instance, speaking to the Emmaus pilgrims, quote, "Beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself." Luke 24:27, the authorized version of the King James Bible. So now at the beginning of a new eon, the individual pursuing the process of individuation may now read these scriptures once again to learn, quote, "those things concerning himself," unquote. Footnotes. The Emerson quote comes from History, The Selected Writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson, page 124. Most of the Jung quotes come from Psychology and Religion, Collected Works, Volume 11. See Rudolf Otto, The Ideas of the Holy, for a discussion of the concept of the numinous. Okay, so that's the introductory video. Any comments or questions on that? Because there's a lot to cover here on these next few paragraphs of Answer to Job. And I have notes which I prepared for my group about a year ago, and I'm going to share those with you. I like that comment. Yes, that's a great one. or Gray, I'm sorry. I really like that comment. Yeah, I've had a few run-ins with religion, and it's taken me a long time to be able to flip my opponent over my shoulder, but I think I can finally do it now. And so anyway, let me offer you some other things to chew on here. I did not complete a recast of the Job paragraphs. They were always on there in the Job playlist. I just now, before this began, I just completed paragraphs 578 to 585, and I will be uploading that immediately after this session. But for the purposes of this session, I'm going to share with you my notes, and the reason for that is I have to get myself positioned so that you'll be able to see me too. The reason for that is that about half of our listeners are listening on their iPhones, and I presume they're not staring at their screen, and if they do stare at their screen, these notes are going to seem awfully small. So I am going to read through them. But anyway, if you have questions as we go along, first of all, in this section, this was from the beginning of a lecture that Dr. Edinger gave on paragraphs 577 to 608. And so I'm just going to give you the various points that he made. And he made a few prefatory points. So first of all, there was a caveat. The caveat was, he's quoting Jung now. He says, I do not write for believers who already possess the whole truth. Rather for the unbelieving but intelligent people who want to understand something, and presumably the people that are in the valley. Anyway, without the psyche you can neither know nor believe. Therefore, everything about which we can speak at all lies in the psychic realm. Even the atom is in this sense a psychic model. And I made the tongue-in-cheek comment that I might put in the dust jacket of my book, nothing here for the believing Christian, because what this is really about is for people who've lost their belief and need to understand how their psyche works and how it relates to the religious life that's all around us. And so Dr. Edinger was talking about the new dispensation of Christianity, or the Judeo-Christian religion. And this came from, I was reading simultaneously his book called Creation of Consciousness, which is this book. It's a very powerful book also, as you can see by all my tabs that are in it. But in any case, he was talking about Ephesians 3:8-9. And the quote is, that they may see what is the dispensation of the mystery which hath been hidden in the eternity in God. It is as though, let me move this up. It is as though man's relation to this hidden mystery of God must be dispensed or administered. In psychological terms, it means, I think, the provision of a worldview that relates man, the ego, to God, the archetypal psyche, and promotes the smooth transfer of energy from one realm to the other. The Christian dispensation is now largely exhausted. Now, this is because of the scientific method punching holes in the Christian dispensation. So now he observes the new psychological dispensation finds man's relation to God in the individual's relation to the unconscious. This is the new context, the new vessel with which humanity can be the carrier of the divine meaning. God is now to be carried experientially by the individual. This is what is meant by the continuing incarnation. And what he says on page 90 of Creation of Consciousness, in essence, the Jewish dispensation was centered in the law, the Christian dispensation was centered in faith, and the psychological dispensation is centered in human experience. Okay, so let me look at some of your questions here. Grace says, I will say this, I have shared this with my mother, who has always believed but struggled with her shadow. Believers need this. Yes, I agree. And I think this is why it's so interesting to watch Paul Vanderklay develop in his own thinking in terms of this. This morning, I sent him just a link to this video, but I pointed out only 90 seconds of it, which begins at 3:40 of this video, and I said, this isn't for your strong believers in your church. This is for the people who've lost their faith or don't find God in their lives. And so that's the section. You might want to go back and listen to this video again. It's on the YouTube channel now, and just listen to that 90 seconds from 3:40 to about 5:20. Actually, it's 100 seconds. Miles says, the believing Christian might be thinking they know, but actually are deluded by dogma and closed-mindedness. I certainly think that dogma and thinking that God is out there prevents you from actually experiencing the divine. And I experience the divine almost every day, but it's in here. It's in my heart. Grace says, I agree, dogma and fundamentalism have been destroyed by the scientific method. And we find in our society a lot of people who are emphatic atheists. The most famous one right now, I guess, is Ron Reagan, who's been putting television ads saying how emphatic he is as an atheist and he doesn't want to be controlled by religion. And he ends his advertisement with "not afraid of burning in hell." Well, you know, that's all well and good, but you know, I'm not afraid of that either. But when my daughter told me that she believed I was going to hell, she put me in hell at that moment, actually. And some of you know my experience with Mephistopheles, which you can find a video of. If you can't find it, ask me and I'll give you the link. But in any case, that experience, which occurred about 20 years ago, literally put me in hell at that moment. And it was one of the driving forces that drove me to learn more about Dr. Jung, because I realized how much that comment of hers hurt me. And it took me a long time to recover. Fortunately, we've had a very good relationship, my daughter and I, over the last 20 years, and still do. But we've never gone back to that particular little incident, which was very important in my life. Grace says, "Bingo, I've been to hell on earth too, Skip, and I will only return to by my choosing. My trip to hell started my journey too." Well, actually, that wasn't the trip to hell that started my journey. I had another experience 10 years before that, but anyway, I've been in hell a few times. When you get up to be my age, maybe you've experienced it a few times. But one of the points of the Job archetype is going through this cycle of contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. And I certainly experienced that with my daughter, where, you know, she made that comment and she went away. So it was a very brief contest. But for me, it was a defeat. It certainly was a defeat, because I was just dropped into hell. Now, whoever teaches a child to say such a thing to their parent, I think that's unconscionable. But in any case, it came over as a defeat for me, and I lamented about it for a long time, a very long time, and I'm talking about years. But as I studied Dr. Jung more and more, it gradually helped me pull out of hell. Miles says, "I remember as a kid a little girl telling me in the playground that I was going to hell. I still remember it vividly." Sure you do. I'm sure you do. Because she was talking about her being baptized, and I didn't know what the hell she was talking about. And, you know, I'm sure that happens to a lot of people, that they get blindsided by some religious pronouncement and they don't know its context or how it fits in their lives. So Grace says, "How would I define the Job archetype?" Well, the Job archetype in detail is contained in Edinger's Encounter with the Self, which I read into the channel over the weekend, and you can find it under Edinger's Portable Analytic Hour, parts 1 and 2. That's the detailed Job experience. But the Job archetype, I have essentialized it because Dr. Edinger did essentialize it in an interview quite near to his death. About 2 months before he died, he was interviewed. And basically he described it as a contest or a drama of some sort, a defeat, in some way, then lamentation about the defeat, reflecting on the defeat, and gradually coming out of it, and that's rebirth and moving on to the next thing. So the simplest example I can offer is the voice. I've used this example many times in my videos. The reality program called The Voice, which provides a huge societal value, because who among us didn't think, oh my God, I could be a rock star? And we probably had a guitar, and we might have had a electric guitar stuff and so on. I think that goes through a lot of kids' minds. It looks like an easy way to make a living. But what The Voice does is it lets a lot of people try. I've seen numbers as high as 250,000, but I don't think it's that many. But they do let a lot of people try out for The Voice. And ultimately they pick something like 150 who actually get on the show in some form. And in the end, they pretty much all fail. And whether the top 10 are able to turn that into something that they can make a living on, I'm not sure. These days we don't hear much of the winners of The Voice. The people who were famous at the beginning and who are the judges are still the famous people, and we're talking about 7-8 years later, and I don't hear too much about the winners of The Voice or America's Got Talent or whatever it is, but when people fail at that, then they realize that they're not going to be a rock star, and that's probably a good thing. And what it does is it strengthens your ego, because then you move on to something else, and you learn that you can survive a failure like that. And so that's a very important feature, and that's basically what Job did. He went through contest after contest in every way that Yahweh could think, and he survived them all. And finally, at the end, Yahweh has to admit that not only does Job have consciousness, he has morality as well. Grace says, I lost that one. Do you define archetype, or does it define you? Well, that's a good question. I would say that it defines you, because archetypes are like programming, and they're built into us. And so let's see, maybe I should pull my notes off the screen for a few minutes, because I'm getting pushed out of the picture here. Okay. All right. So let's just talk about archetypes for a minute. Archetypes are like programming in your computer, and the programming is going to execute, and it's going to execute all the way through, whatever it is. And archetypes are just like that. And so the easiest example of that is the mother archetype. The easiest to see is the mother archetype. And we see that in women who become mothers, because they may have had all kinds of other ideas about their life, but as soon as they're a mother, bang, all the programming of motherhood operates through them, and it never stops. With maybe a few notable exceptions, 1 or 2%, but for most women who become mothers, they're a mother for the rest of their lives, and they work through the entire programming of motherhood. Um, and and you can clearly see the mother archetype in other species. It's very plain to see now because we have um, lots of cameras on bird nests and on Africa and various places where we can see animals in the wild, and we can see mothers in the wild, and they all behave in more or less the same motherly way. Um, you know, Deb and I have watched the Decorah eagles from time to time, and let's see, when was it? I guess it was last February or so. We were watching the Decorah eagle mother, and she had 2 or 3 eggs under her, and there was a horrific snowstorm. So you could see in the image, which was a night vision image, her sitting there, and she had a pile of snow on top of her head. But she was not going to move off those eggs come hell or high water. And you know, nowadays, as the babies are starting to hatch, you can really see the mother instinct play out. And so Miles was talking about the self instinct earlier. I mean, the self is the deepest archetype in the unconscious and the most powerful, and what Jungians call the God image. And when the God image decides that it's going to do something, and it wants you to do something, it lets you know. It's very clear, and it feels like God talking. I was talking with Miles earlier today, and I said, you know, I had this experience yesterday because this video that I just showed you, I was having a tremendous difficulty making it. I made a bunch of stupid mistakes. Actually, it was I was working on the video, and I saw a comment come in from Gray Yates, as a matter of fact. And so I went over. I usually just let the video go because I can always cut things out. And so I let the video go. I went over and I responded to Gray, and then I kept doing my reading. The only problem was that when I went over to respond to Gray, I had activated the video that he was responding to. And so the result was I had not only my reading, but the other video playing in the background, which was a big mess. And that consumed about 25 minutes of the reading that I had already done. So I had to go back and reread the entire thing because it was totally useless. And I had a number of other technical difficulties with that video. So by the end of the day, I was pretty exhausted, and I was just having second thoughts about, oh, geez, is this such an important video? I thought it was, but, you know, maybe it can wait. I'm exhausted. So I went in, and I started to take a short nap. And during my nap, I had the following dream. I was in a rowboat in a very storm-tossed sea at night, and in the rowboat I had a package, a backpack, and in that backpack I had explosives. Now this is metaphorical, so please don't think I play with such things, but I had explosives, and so metaphorically those explosives represent the power of the video that I was making. And I then jumped into the sea because I was just giving up after the sea had tossed me through the day trying to make this video. And as I jumped into the sea, this huge arm comes down over the rowboat, and it's a male right hand, very gnarly, And on the ring finger was this gold ring with a sapphire, a huge sapphire on the gold ring. And this huge arm picks me up and puts me back in the rowboat. And then I woke up and I said, oh my God, that's myself saying, get that video done. It was a very, very meaningful to me. And so here's this archetype, myself, my God image, communicating to me by showing me these images and telling me, pick up your explosives and get back to work, man. So, for whatever it's worth, it's sort of an interesting story. So Agatha Fry says, when people are given such simple external solutions to internal mind and heart issues like baptism and hell, the danger lies in no longer seeing the self as the source of both trouble and healing. Trouble with fundamentalism, as I see it in a nutshell. I think that's a fundamental issue of our world, and you see everyone, even people my age, you see running around with their nose in iPhones today. And, it occurred to me that what we're looking for in that iPhone is ourself. We're trying to find something that we're missing in our lives. All of us are doing that, or most of us. I won't say everybody's got a cell phone, but certainly most people who do have a smartphone are at some point in the day staring at the screen and not communicating with people around them. And that keeps us superficial. And so does listening to music all the time. And I remember when I was about 40, up until the time I was 40, I felt like I had to have the radio on in the car all the time. And I just didn't feel good. And it was like I was afraid to listen to my psyche. Okay, I was afraid to listen to myself. And I forget what the event was that caused me to turn off the radio. But I turned it off, and I've never turned it back on. And the reason, so my wife and I occasionally will listen to some music on the car radio, but very rarely, or if there's news. Most of the time, we drive in silence, or we drive conversing with one another. And that entirely changed my life, because when I drive alone, I'm hearing things all the time from my psyche, and I do not feel alone at all. And because I think before I was 40, I might have felt threatened by it, so I was listening to music as a self-defense to prevent me from paying attention to myself. But after that moment, when I was about 40 and I turned off the radio, oh my God, and I started to realize that I was communicating with my unconscious and hearing my unconscious out. Wow, that changed everything. And I never went back to it. Music is not very interesting to me anymore. I very rarely listen to music on the radio. Of course, I do have a bad case of tinnitus. I hear, since I was 25, I had ringing in my ears. It happened when I was at the pistol range in the Marine Corps, and all these loud explosions right next to my ear. That was before we forced everybody to wear earplugs on the pistol range. And ever since then, I've had tinnitus, and if I meditate on it, if I meditate and think about the tinnitus, I can hear 12 distinct frequencies of, it sounds something like a fax tone. That would be one frequency, but I hear 12 different ones. Okay. So Gray says there's nothing simple about this. It is bothersome when this is sold as simple, when living this story out as anything but simple. It's definitely not simple, Gray. And, even I, who instigated and started my reading group, and I would urge all of you to consider starting reading groups in your communities, and you can, I've provided lots of raw material for that to make it easy for you, but something from myself was forcing me to want to communicate things about Dr. Jung's oeuvre. That was definitely true. That was being pushed through. And I remember telling people that in those early days that we were, that Dr. Jung's psychology is like circumambulating a center. And as each time you go around, you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And very honestly, I had no idea how deep it would be. When we started, I may have read one or two of Dr. Edinger's books over the years, but I had not grokked at that point how very significant his work was and is to religion. And it was only last summer when, let me see if I can reach it. Yes. Let's see if I can knock over the screen here. Sorry for that. Last summer, when I was recovering from knee replacement, I found this book, The New God Image by Edward Edinger. And this book, as you see, it's got a few tabs in it. And the reason it has a few tabs in it is that it is so profound. And what the book is Dr. Edinger's analysis of 14 letters, only 14, and they're in this book. These letters are in the appendix of this book from Dr. Jung, which basically talk about the God image in the Jungian sense. And until I read this book, I hadn't really grokked it. What I realized from reading this book is that the Jungian institutes and all of these Jung societies around the country have basically hidden the religious aspect of Dr. Jung's work since the beginning. I think that they created a profession of psychotherapy, and I think they were protecting their fledgling profession against attack by theologians. And so they basically slipped it under the rug and didn't talk about the religious aspects of Dr. Jung's oeuvre. But if you look at it, particularly the late works, you realize that it's all about that. And yes, there are applications in psychotherapy, I'm sure of that, and analysis is largely about that. I apologize for how bright this screen is. We're having a very wet snowstorm today, so if this goes off, if this session goes off, it is primarily because I lost power here, because we have very wet snow. It's very heavy. It's killing a a lot of branches and trees, I'm sure. But anyway, what I had the insight of was that Jungian analysts and the Jungian institutes themselves have hidden the religious aspects of Dr. Jung's work. And, in some sense, I understand that, because the Jungian analysts are going into a profession. They wanted to protect their profession. And they didn't want to get a lot of static from theologians. But I've now had them admit to me face to face. And so, you look at these programs that the Jung societies put on all over the United States and all over the world, really, and they're very, let's say, superficial. I consider those organizations as basically intake groups for Jungian analysts to find analysans, and they don't really go into depth. And so, I'm not an analyst. I have no aspirations to be a psychotherapist, and so I don't have the same stricture that they have. But anyway, let's see. Clive says, also, what are the constituent elements of the conscious individual ego according to Jung, or is it a whole in itself? Clive, it's a whole in itself, and what I urge you to do is read the first chapter of Ion, and you will find on this YouTube channel a playlist right on the homepage of the channel called, Ion Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. And what the first 4 chapters do is they describe the basic structure of the psyche. And so Dr. Jung began with the ego because that's the first thing that we experience in our lives. And then the second chapter is the shadow, which is the other side of the ego. And the third chapter is the Psyche, which is the yoked pair of the anima and the animus. Let's see if I still have the illustration here. I'm not sure I do. Is this? Oh, yes. Okay. So this is the illustration of the first 4 chapters of Ion, with the self being at the deepest level, and with 3 versions of the ego at the top 3 circles. So chapter 1 is the top 3 circles, and under those circles is a shadow, and then your perception of the self goes down through the anima and the animus, through the Psyche, to the self. And it's the personal self, but it goes down to societal self, and let's see, I don't know if I can point at it. Okay, so it goes down to the personal self, the societal self, and the universe. And all of that is part of the self, part of the collective unconscious. I hope that's helpful. But Dr. Edinger puts that illustration in chapter 3 or chapter 4 of his book called called the Ion Lectures. I have it here as it so happens, so I will, so I can show it to you. So here it is in the Ion Lectures, and it is on page 31, and the page before that is the syzygy, which he's describing as a yoked pair, and so that image of oxen tied up to a wagon is a syzygy, and so the yoke is the tying together of the two aspects, the anima and the animus, and then the fourth chapter is the self. So Dr. Jung is starting at the top with chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's the primary structure of the psyche. Gray says, Skip, you're welcome for screwing up your video and giving you an encounter with the God image. I definitely had that. Clive says, also there's a quote about people not looking low enough in order to see God. Could I speak to that? Yes, that quote is in a number of places, but you can find it in, I believe it's chapter 1 of Man and His Symbols, and it refers to an old rabbinical story where an individual goes to his rabbi and he says, Rabbi, why don't people see God the way they used to in the old days? And the rabbi says, because no one can stoop low enough. And what he means is that we are all inflated beings, basically. And maybe we ought to bring ourselves, become a little bit more humble, and then we might realize that we too can communicate with God. Miles says, I keep hearing this new word grok. Is it American slang? Miles, grok is a term that was used by a novelist in about 1961, and the novel is called A Stranger in a Strange Land, I believe. And basically the entire novel is a definition of the term grok. And you can find it on the internet, on Wikipedia. Just put in define and quotation marks G-R-O-K, close quotation marks, and it'll come right up. I don't remember the author's name, I'm sorry to say, but basically he describes it as fully understanding something, and it's not as simple as I get it. It's I get every aspect of this situation. And so one of the examples he gives is of a race from another world that has entirely grokked a race that it totally destroyed. And it only fully grokked it when it destroyed the race entirely. And so it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the quick answer. And so I like to use the term because it means to me something which is understanding something at depth, okay? Understanding something so deeply that you understand, most of the things about it that could be said. Agatha says, fun to hear your perspective on music versus silence. Is the opposite of my own experience. Music helped wake me up. Poetry and music bridged a gap in me. Thanks for the reply. Though silence has certainly played its part in a huge way, running and returning. Well, surely music does get us to a place we want to be, and all of us have a song. In fact, you'll see it in my notes here if we get to them. That songs do have a very deep meaning to us, and so when you hear a song, it will take you to a place in your unconscious, maybe that you hadn't thought about for 30 years or something like that. So music can be a bridge like that, and certainly in the first half of life. I mean, I think Dr. Jung's perspective, he wasn't very interested in people in their first half of life, because basically he regarded children as wild animals, and until we're 40 or 45, basically he says until you're 40 or you're 45, you're just doing research. After that is when the meaning of your life really emerges. Now, we may have some precocious participants here, like I suspect Gray Yates might be under 40, and so there may be some precocious people who had the individuation process activated early, but most people are just learning how to live, and they get caught in the raising of children. I always remember Pete Seeger singing "Kisses Sweeter Than Wine," because it starts out, when I was a young man, I'd never been kissed. I got to thinking over what I had missed. And it goes on till he's a grandfather of 8 or something like that. And so as long as you're caught up in the whole whirl of first learning how to be a human being and then how to raise a family of children, you don't have quite as much time to go back and think about these bigger spiritual issues. And it's only when you have more time that you can sit back for whatever reason and find the spiritual aspect of yourself. I guess that's the way I would put it. And so, since music is a big part of young people, and then we tend to have these linkages back to our youth, and I certainly have a lot of those. I just don't go out of my way to listen to music anymore, because I don't want to be taken back there. I want to stay here and do the things that I do. And so it almost interrupts me to listen to music these days. Clive says, did Jung ever talk about the experience of time? Certainly he did. He talked about the space-time continuum and how time and space are perceptions, but they're, well, he talked about, I was reading today, he talked about a quaternity, and the quaternity is space, time, and causality, which makes most things happen, but these things are always in the pleroma, which is the background basis of everything that we do. And that's one of the things that Dr. Edinger talks about in that hour-long video, which I've on the other video I showed. If you find that video, you'll find a link to my transcript of Edinger's video plus the video itself, and so you can read along. But he talks about the background, the source of everything. And so one of the things that Dr. Jung says, and we might get to it in my notes here, is that, for example, the birth of Christ was always existing in the pleroma. It was destined to happen. And it happened that it occurred with this one man, Jesus Christ. But now we have to move on and understand better what the meaning of Christ's late message, which was the coming of the Paraclete, the coming of the third part of the Trinity, namely the Holy Ghost. And what does that mean? It means that each one of us has a chance for incarnation and continuing incarnation. And if we see ourselves in that way, it can make a lot of difference in the meaning, in its meaning to the world. Agatha says she'll look that one up. I'm not sure which one she's talking about. So Agatha, if you'll be more specific, I'll take a look. Miles says, I always have Todd Rundgren's song, Love is the Answer, in my mind. Okay, that's what she's referring to. Okay, I don't even think I know that particular song, but I think Dr. Jung did believe that love was very significant. And if you read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, basically the last thing he's talking about in that book, which was a memoir of his psychological development, is the concept of love. And he says, I've never been able to define it. Let's see. Miles says, Grace says, I appreciate you, Skip. I gotta go live the coach archetype at the track meet. Good luck, Gray. I hope you win the track meet, and when you come back, you can listen to the last part of this video where I'm going to hopefully continue on. I am going to go back to my notes now because there's a lot here, and I don't know if we can get to a lot of it. We will try. We haven't even started the paragraphs of Answer to Job yet, but let me give it a go. Let's see. Okay, so page 90, I'm talking about the creation of consciousness here, which is Edinger's book. It says, if the individual stands over against the primitive Yahweh, it affects within him. He allows, so what the individual has to do is understand Yahweh, but understand Yahweh being the primitive self, okay, but understand that Yahweh, the self, doesn't have to live in the 21st century. You do. And so, quote, if he allows them to live without repressing them, which would be depression, and without identifying with them, which would be inflation. So the self is sending up ideas all the time. Some of them are good ideas. Some of them are really bad ideas. And if you just let your ideas come and let them run and they stay in fantasy, that's a good idea. But if you identify with those, then it becomes an inflation. And I think that a lot of us can see, primitive psyche coming through in our current affairs in the United States. and so the two rocks that we have to operate between, the two rocks, are inflation, getting too ahead of ourselves, or depression, where we're repressing all of our ideas and not doing anything. Then we can start to get depressed. And I always look back to the quote, which I have taped to my computer now because I can never get it precisely right. I don't know why. I have some sort of psychic block, so I can never get it precisely right. But the quote is, "Too much of the animal distorts civilized man. Too much civilization makes sick animals." And so we have to live in that space between our instincts and the civilized world. And so the issue is that our instincts, which is where the self is and where the self archetype comes from, is the result of billions of years of evolution, literally going back to the Big Bang. I mean, the Big Bang was our father and our mother combined, and all of our ancestors were not human. They became human, but if we go back far enough, we can find great apes in our ancestry, and before that, other species. And you see that in physical biology, where a fetus goes through these various stages of development in the womb, and finally when it's born as a human being, but all our primitive ancestors are still there, and we may not like to admit that, but that's a fact. And so our self, our God instinct, our God image, is based on what Jung called the 2 million year old man. Well, actually, it's much older than that. We now know he died in 1961, so he didn't see a lot of the discoveries that we've had since then. But he called it the 2 million year old man within us, and that's what the self is. But your self was issued on the day you were born, and it hasn't changed since. And so while it hasn't changed, your ego does have to change, and your ego does have to live in the 21st century. And so it's incumbent upon you to evaluate the messages that you are getting from the unconscious. In the dream that I described earlier in this session, obviously the self was literally communicating with me about that video, and that's well and good. That's a specific message to me about my life and my life right now, and there wasn't anything questionable about that. But when my psyche says, let's go 90 miles an hour on the highway, I have to tone it down. And I think all of us have those experiences from time to time, maybe not involving the highway. I know that my anima, which is another one of the very deep psychological archetypes, it's my feminine side. For all of us, it is the part of us that tells us, that's the woman for me, or if you're a woman, it's the animus that tells you that's the man for you. The problem with it is that's the way it operates. And so in my case, my anima was affected by my mother having long brown hair when I was a little boy. And I've had a picture of her throughout my life, and that was drawn by a Greek artist in 1947 based on a picture that my father had of my mother when she was a senior in high school, and obviously she was quite lovely. And so both of my wives have had long brown hair, and but once you marry and then you're doing something different from finding a mate, your anima or your animus still operates in the same way. And so that's how we get into trouble, because you see your anima, you see your ideal woman or your ideal man out there in society, and you're already married. Well, that's not a very good thing, and that's also how I'm sure a lot of marriages get in trouble. Let's see. Clive says, does Yahweh have a specific meaning, or does it simply mean God? Yahweh is a statement in Hebrew, which is represented by 4 consonants. Let's see, it's YHWH in Hebrew. I don't know the Hebrew letters, how to say them, but because they don't have, this word has no consonants, the rest of us need to add the A in the first syllable and the E in the second syllable in order to say this. And so I think that my Jewish rabbi friend would probably say this something like a Yahweh or something like that, but we Philistines say it as Yahweh. But it does represent, from a Jungian point of view, it would represent the God image, the self. And I urge you all to watch the 2 videos that I put together over the weekend from Edinger's book, Encounter with the Self, in which he's talking about Job's experience from a psychological point of view, and he uses William Blake's etchings about the Job story, which are quite remarkable because they were done in 1825, and because they show the evolution of the psyche in Job. And evolution per se wasn't even discovered by Darwin until about more than 20 years later. I mean, his voyage on the Beagle was in 1845, and then he came back and did his writing. I don't think his writing even came out until the mid-1850s. So here was Blake at the end of his life, already intuitively understanding the psychological evolution of a human being. And of course, this is 65 years before Freud ever said anything about the psyche. Clive says, is it a good idea to construe the world as construed around you in an empirical, materialistic, impersonal sense, or is even that too inflationary? I don't know if I would call it inflationary. Obviously, we have to live in the 21st century, and so you have to understand what empirically is presented to you with your physical senses. And the issue that that Edinger was making in that interview was that issues that happen in the psyche are not material, and therefore what Jung's oeuvre represents is the development of a scientific approach to the psyche, which is every bit as big as the physical world. And in fact, it's more so because every one of us has a psyche, and each one of our psyches is as big as the universe and more, because not only will it contain perceptions about the physical world, but it will also contain perceptions about fantasy and God and various other things. So Clive says, I mean, in terms of searching for meaning, that the world is built around that. Well, you're not going to find meaning, or at least not very deep meaning, in the material world. The problem is that in the material world, they try to sell us on meaning. They try to sell us a beautiful automobile or what have you on the television, and then that becomes a meaning. For example, Land Rover has this advertisement right now of this red car climbing 999 steps to this Chinese temple. And, that's all well and good, but what they don't tell you is that in the end of that scene, the car wishbones itself at the top of the steps and it can't go any further. But they don't say that. They just make it seem like that was the intended result. But that wasn't the intended result, and the car ended up getting stopped. And you can see that quite clearly in the advertisement. And so, you can have a BMW and you can dream about going up those steps, but in the end, might not be what you expect. And also, if you have a BMW in your driveway, it still needs oil changes, and it still needs new tires, and it still can only go in the United States. Even if you take the gratuitous 7 miles an hour over the speed limit, in most places we can't go over about 72 miles an hour. But a BMW in Europe, where there aren't speed restrictions, in some places you can go 220 kilometers per hour or something like that. And so you can dream of doing that, but after you've done it, it's not so special. I mean, I did it once with my daughters, where we rented a car and drove all over Europe, and we traveled largely at 100 miles an hour. We didn't have a BMW. We had an Opel Kadett, and so I had the accelerator flat on the floor, and it would go 100 miles an hour. And so all the other traffic is going 100 miles an hour, and very soon you get acclimatized to that. But after you've done it, it's not that special. You do get around a bit faster, but it's also considerably more dangerous. So, and so anyway, in terms of looking for meaning, Clive, I think that all of us have to search for that, and it's not an easy thing. The metaphor that I use for it is Michelangelo's David, where that block of marble had within it as its meaning the statue of David, and it always had it in the marble. It was there for probably a few billion years, I suppose. And the block of marble, when it was dragged into Florence, I think it was Florence, it sat next to a cathedral for 54 years, and two other artists started to work on it, but then they just decided it was too much for them. And finally Michelangelo started, and he worked on it for 4 years, and he chipped away and chipped away and chipped away and chipped away, and gradually David emerged, and that becomes the meaning of that marble. And it's also a representation of Michelangelo's self, too, I presume. I mean, who but a god could produce a sculpture like that? I don't know, but the point is, the meaning of your life is going to be learned through chipping away at it, which the way I refer to it, and you can find a video on the channel called How to Have an Authentic Life. And the way to do that is to go through this Job cycle as many times as possible, and recognize that every time you're defeated, that just means that's not the meaning of your life. You need to find what the meaning is, and you can dedicate a lot of time to something that you think has meaning, and then find out it has no meaning, like the kids who go to The Voice, and maybe they finish third, and they're not defeated until the end, and so they have the raw material to make a successful career as a singer. But, you know, after the first year, I mean, in the first year, sometimes they tour, but after the first year, I don't remember hearing of any people from The Voice. And even the new coach, who is one of the winners of the early rounds of one of these programs, I had never heard of her until they made her a coach on The Voice. So you just have to keep going through these disappointments, and each time you do, you strengthen your ego, because you find out that you can cope with that too, and ultimately, the meaning of your life will emerge. You know, obviously, to a certain degree, the production of this video channel has become a kind of meaning of my life, and making my observations and experiences available to a wider audience, so that you too can have experiences that are informed by Dr. Jung. That is the meaning of my life, and it is based on having a lot of false starts. And, you know, I have other meanings in my life. I have 9 grandchildren, and they have meaning. But you know, you need at least one meaning in your life. If you can't find a meaning in your life, then you should, because if you don't, then that's a recipe for depression, and it can become suicidal and so on. So it's better to find something that gets your motor running in the morning. Clive says, sorry, I guess I should say that material world comes out of experience. That is a part of yourself in some sense. Well, life comes out of experience, and this is my quibble with Dr. Jordan Peterson. You know, I don't disagree with almost anything that he says. I mean, he has a lot of experience as a psychotherapist, which I am not, and I respect a lot of the things that he says, almost all, and I think that he gives a lot of good advice to young men who have no clear vision about where they're going. But the essence of a university degree or of studying is to give you some sort of order and structure to work with, but it's not life. Okay, when you let's say you're never going to go past a high school diploma, for example. Everything that you learn in high school is only intended so that you can do a certain number of things, but those are orderly things, whatever they are, that you learn in high school, but they aren't yet life. Then when you finish that, people drop out of high school, they just turn their backs on that, on learning that order the easy way, which is what education is, and then they go out into life, into eros, into the experience of life, and then they find out what experience is, and eventually through that experience meaning emerges. It's like the statue of David. I mean, David didn't emerge in the first year when Michelangelo started to chip away at it. It took 4 years. And so the meaning of our lives are actually more complicated than that, because it takes time to chip away. Miles says, regarding Peterson, that's ditto for me. So anyway, I quip that Peterson is all logos all the time, and he's written this book, The 12 Rules of Life, and although he's in general a follower of Dr. Jung, as I pointed out in my critique of that book, Dr. Jung's position on rules of life is that he lived by no rules. He thought it was best if you lived by no rules. And so the rules of life are like the rules of the U.S. Marine Corps. Okay, I was a Marine Corps officer, and I went to my training as an officer candidate and became a second lieutenant, and so then I knew all the rules. But then I went to Vietnam, and in Vietnam I had real experiences, and I learned how certain rules are not followed, and I saw people punished, people losing their lives because they didn't follow rules, and people who survived not expecting to. And so, I mean, it just depends, but obviously you have to get out and have an experience of life, and that's eros, that's not logos. And so logos may give you guidelines for how we live. Dr. Edinger made a comment in one of these videos in the last couple of days where, or I guess it was Jung's comment, but he said, wait a minute, I know where it was. Okay, he said, we must read the Bible or we shall not understand psychology. Our psychology, whole lives, our language and imagery are built upon the Bible. And so everything that we have in North America, I'm not talking about the Muslim world, so we might have some Muslim folks listening to this video, but certainly in the Judeo-Christian world in the West, everything that we have in our society was built on the Judeo-Christian myth in one way or another. And even if we're atheists or agnostic, we can't deny the fact that our civilization is actually structured on biblical stories, and layers of our unconscious psyche have been built up based on the stories in the Bible. And so, Dr. Jung was acknowledging that, in the West, we can't do anything without the Bible, and, in the Muslim world, you can't do anything without the Quran, and, in China, you can't do anything without the Tao Te Ching, and so forth. And in Buddhism, which applies to most of China and Japan and Korea, and many Westerners now as well, we have the 84,000 teachings of the Buddha, of which only about 5,000 or so have even been translated at this point. And so I think we have a lot to learn. And obviously Buddha and Christ reflected a lot of earlier teachings, lessons, experiences. But it's a very interesting observation that, in fact, I do have this image which I'll share with you. Let me drop that one for a minute and bring this one up. Okay, this is an image from Blake's etchings of Yahweh showing Job his backside, and his backside amounts to Leviathan and Behemoth. He's pointing out Leviathan and Behemoth, and basically what he's pointing out, which is the backside of God, is that it took hundreds of millions of years and many false starts before a creature was created with consciousness, namely us. And so it was Job that realized that that it's us that have to be moral, and we are created by this backside of God, which is hundreds of millions of years of evolution to get to this point. And so Dr. Jung is observing, in answer to Job, that Job had something that God didn't have, namely consciousness, number one, and morality, number two, because God, Yahweh, is an amoral force of nature. Yahweh is not a kindly father figure sitting up in the sky somewhere watching over you. And so he says, it's a question of leaving behind the children's story and growing up and realizing that we're it. And yes, we have a God image within us, and but it's up to us to make something of that. It's not going to be made by some entity that is not carried in a human ego. And so Yahweh, as an amoral force of nature, relies for his morality on human beings. That's one of the fundamental and shocking issues that comes up in answer to Job. And so so here in this, so the remarkable thing is that here Job recognized this 500 years BC, and also the Buddha recognized it as well at about the same time. And so it's recognizing the evolution of the human psyche 2,300 or 2,500 years ago. And you know, maybe they wouldn't have described it as the evolution of the human psyche, but that's what it was. And here's Yeats, who created these 22 etchings 25 years before Darwin. And so so he too was realizing it at some level, some unconscious level perhaps, because this is long before Freud and Jung started to write and started to talk. And so anyway, let's see, let me go back. Okay, so I think that I'm pretty close to the end of this, but so basically what Edinger is saying in this book, The Creation of Consciousness, is if he, human being, struggles to extract the images of meaning that lie embedded in the psyche, if he patiently and diligently seeks the way of individuation, which the unconscious both reveals and withholds, so it's not all just revelation, then his efforts will have a gradual transformative effect on Yahweh. He will be offering himself as a crucible for the transformation of the dark God, and contributing his widow's mite, his little piece, to the cosmic drama of continuing creation. And that's the essence of what Dr. Jung was talking about, is the continuing incarnation. And that is represented by the Holy Ghost in Christianity. We all must do just what Christ did. We must make our experiment, is what Dr. Jung said also. What basically what he's saying is that the heavy burden the hero carries, all of us carry that in ourselves, or rather the self, our wholeness, is both God and animal. Okay, and so the point is that it's not us making something happening inside, it's inside coming out. And so once the self has been constellated, so that the archetype record, if you will, begins to play, once that starts to happen, it's not going to stop. It doesn't stop. And it plays through us. And it's up to us to figure out what God should be going forward. It's the Holy Ghost playing itself through us. That was Dr. Jung's fundamental insight, that it's not us forcing a change. It's not our ego forcing a change and forcing whatever. It is the self, the God image, coming out through us, and we need to recognize that. Let's see, Miles says, powerful stuff. Can we say the divine feminine Sophia is the Holy Ghost? No. because the Holy Ghost is part of the Trinity, and the feminine, which did start to come through at the time of Job. So people ask, when did feminism begin? And, some people would say, well, it began with Susan B. Anthony, who was born in 1865, but that's not true, because the feminine wisdom started coming through at the time of Job, and even before Job, because Proverbs was written. I don't actually know when Proverbs was written, so I'm sorry to say, but Proverbs establishes that Sophia was in the pleroma from the very beginning. And so that, whenever that book in the Bible was added, was a recognition of the patriarchy, that there is a feminine side of God, and that is Sophia, and that is wisdom. And actually the word philosophy, which I didn't know, which one of my group members taught me, is that philosophy means, philo means love, and Sophie means Sophia. So it's the love of wisdom. And so that element, the feminine, has been a part of the Holy Scriptures since the beginning. And and Dr. Jung is very excited later on in answer to Job, because in 1950, Pope Pius XII recognized that the Virgin Mary had ascended into heaven, which happened as a result of basically public opinion coming through, unconscious contents coming through all the parishioners of Catholicism, which, when everybody's praying the rosary and praying to the Virgin Mary, then she has some divine significance, and it had to be recognized. And so Dr. Jung considered that the most important religious event since the Reformation, because it was a recognition that the feminine was coming through. And he believed that the dogma that was issued at that time of the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary was a very, very important event in terms of the feminine coming through. But it's not the Holy Ghost. The Holy Ghost is the third emanation of God, and the Holy Ghost is a ghost. It's a spirit, and it's within each one of us. And God, and if you read the things that Jesus himself said, especially about the coming of the Paraclete and the Holy Ghost, or which was the Holy Ghost, he was saying that he had to leave so that the Paraclete could come. So what did he mean by that? It meant that as long as he was there, everybody was going to focus on him. And once he was gone, then the Holy Ghost would infuse itself into everyone. Well, it kind of did, or at least for a quarter of the world's population. And it is still infusing itself through all of us, whether we consider ourselves good Christians or not. I'm a Christian, but I never go to church per se. I don't regard church as important to me. But I definitely feel the Holy Ghost in me, and I'm sure that Dr. Jung felt it in him as well. Let's see. Clive says, had there been any talk in the Bible or Jung about the physical body and its development. Peterson talks about a physiological sense of meaningful engagement in a positive sense. Is that supported? I think it is, Clive, in the sense of the image that I was showing you earlier. I don't know that it was conscious, and so I don't know that anybody really wrote down what these physical implications are. But certainly there is reference to it in the book of Job. That's the significance of God showing Job behemoth. And let me just see. Okay, there's a midrash about this. Midrash is a story from Judaism, and what it talks about is the banquet of Behemoth and Leviathan, which means that we're quote unquote eating or assimilating these earlier manifestations of life. And Edinger makes the following comment: the Messianic age signifies psychologically the coming of the self, the achievement of individuation. As the legend puts it, the primordial psyche becomes food for the pious. In other words, it will be transformed and humanized as it is assimilated by the ego under the guidance of the self. And so that's what the banquet of Behemoth and Leviathan mean, is that we're taking our primordial psyche and we're assimilating it into our physical lives today. And obviously, all of us recognize that we have certain instinctual urges from time to time, and if we recognize those things and assimilate them into our life, then we can say, okay, that's what that is. That's part of my primordial urges, but those primordial urges don't necessarily have to live in the 21st century. I guess that's the point. And so that's talking about a physical assimilation. Now, I've gotten to Edinger's 9 points from this lecture, and I think what I want to do, because it's already 3:23, so we've already been at it for 2 hours here, and there's a lot to talk about, obviously, but I'm going to hold these 9 points that Edinger made until next week, and then I'll start to go through them point by point and paragraph by paragraph. But obviously we had to get through a lot of basic understandings about what Drs. Edinger and Jung were talking about before we get to that. So next week we'll begin with this same class note with Edinger's 9 points from his lecture about this part of Answer to Job, which goes up to paragraph 608. So I'm in the process of consolidating the Answer to Job readings. I had, when I did them last summer, what I did was create a separate video for every paragraph, and that became very cumbersome to people. So what I am doing is consolidating those paragraphs into longer videos of around 15 to 20 minutes each. And so I just before this session completed paragraphs 578 to 585, and that video is made as soon as we log off here. I will upload that, and it'll be available online. I'm going to get those notes off the screen and move back into the middle of the picture here. And I'll endeavor to get everything up to paragraph 608 into consolidated videos before next week. And next week we'll go back to our Thursday at 1:30 time for further discussion. There's a lot here to assimilate just in what we've talked about so far today. So I urge you to go back and think about it, and certainly read the book. I mean, if you don't have a copy of Answer to Job, I urge you to get a copy and read it, because as Edinger said, here's my copy and here's all my taps in it, and you see how I underline it. So in every place you see the really dark underlining is something that I think is really important. So there's a lot. And mind you, when I was working with my physical reading group on this book, I was also simultaneously reading Edinger's Transformation of the God Image, which is his 10 lectures on Answer to Job, and also this book, The Creation of Consciousness. So I was combining all three of those. I have in these notes that I'm presenting you here, I am including observations from all three of those books. And so I urge you to get all of them and read them, but especially Answer to Job itself. You probably can't follow along adequately unless you've read Answer to Job. And, while it may be convenient and functional to just listen to my readings of it, I find that unless I can read and physically look at a book, I can't really grok it, to use the term again, Mouse. So anyway, any other questions now on what we've covered today, or anything else that you have? Because I'd like to terminate the Q&A within the next 2 minutes, because I think what YouTube does is it doesn't shut you off after 2 hours, but what it does is it starts overwriting the beginning, which is what happened to me the other night. And so after 2 hours, it'll start overwriting the beginning of the video for this session, and we'll lose that. So I'd rather terminate now, and my voice is giving up on me, and we'll continue on next week, Thursday at 1:30. But please do check back on this link, the link that you're on right now watching this video. If you're watching live, the link that you're on is the live broadcast video for my channel, and it's always the same. Please do check back on this URL to just see, because this week I did it early because of my doctor's appointment tomorrow, which I might not ultimately get to, looking out the window as I am. We have a lot of snow coming in, and Well, for someone who lives in Alberta, Miles, it's extremely light. I mean, I think you wouldn't even call this a snowfall in Alberta. But here in Maryland, where drivers don't know how to drive in the snow, it's life-threatening. So I may not get to my doctor's appointment now, so we'll have to just see when it gets rescheduled if that happens. But anyway, thank you all for coming. I'll see you next time. The next broadcast will be the group meeting on Monday, the 26th of March at 8 p.m. So I look forward to seeing you all then. And I'm signing off. Have fun reading.